All right. So we're speaking today because of your decolonizing ritual and the arts that you share with us in the INDERNET exhibition. And I know that you created this piece from a very specific point of view as someone from the Indo-Caribbean community. And for those who are not familiar with the Indo-Caribbean community and history, what are some of the elements that you would like to share with others to, introduce people to our community?
Yeah. Well, so I mean, indeed, it's a huge topic for me. Obviously, it's been shaping me already from my childhood, the day when I was born, growing up in the Netherlands, in the neighborhood uh, called Transvaal, ironically, which is also the neighborhood which houses the largest population of Indo-Caribbeans in the Netherlands. It has the highest concentration, and I grew up at the middle of it, just across the place where we have the first Bollywood store in the Netherlands. So growing up with that reality, it has so many dimensions to me. And specifically, what is why it is important for me to create work departing from this identity and this experienced reality, is that I actually experienced a lot of silence throughout my youth, throughout life. Silence about traumas that we're literally building in this very life that I'm living right now, traumas that my parents are carrying with them from their past, and also my grandparents, and of course beyond. And this is really an ongoing process for me, and this whole idea of trauma and breaking the silence is has become extremely important for me to set about healing for myself, but also for the communities at large. And this history specifically means that, from what I know, is that my great great grandparents were brought to Suriname from India, right? As what we still call today indentured labor, but which I would also like to consider more as forced labor migration. So this started in, or started, we can use a date, which is 1873, for which the first boat, Le Larouk, arrived into Suriname. But that legacy, again, is really built upon something that goes beyond that date and is really rooted in the entire colonial project. And this whole entire colonial project, or just colonialism as we call it, has been really shaping our realities today so much, but has also brought the whole world together in a very, well, painful way, I would say. So there is already maybe a lot of the dimensions that you can hear. The reality of being an Indo-Caribbean and this history is that uh, the country we were brought to, Suriname, but also all the other countries Indian indentured laborers were brought to, uh, are multicultural societies, or have become multicultural societies by force. So that dimension again as well has fed so much into how I make work and why I make this work. It is trauma healing, breaking the silence, but it's also a common language that I think mankind share actually all over the world. This is
So
maybe in short.
thank you. Yeah, you addressed so many dimensions, and I would like to unpack that and see, also where the identity of our community has been shaped, also in terms of current society. So let's start with the trauma that you mentioned, and you already mentioned forced labor rather than indentured labor. That's something that I can really relate to. Also, being part of the Indo-Caribbean community and actually realizing that um, it's a very specific identity in relation to South Asian identity. You know, you have this Caribbean aspect that when, for instance, when I went to India, I realized how Caribbean I was. I was also very European, but also very Caribbean. So we'll get back to that later on. But there's a specific trauma that you mentioned, and people, even from our community, don't always realize what that trauma is, because the term indentured labor implies consent, right? So the idea and the history that we're being told is that our ancestors gave consent. They signed a contract to go to Suriname, and they got paid, and all was well for the labor that they did. When in reality, you know, there were so many dimensions that resembled slavery. It was really a new form of slavery. You know, our ancestors worked in the same plantations as the formerly enslaved. So I'm curious to hear your perspective on the types of trauma that you encountered in diving into the history, and how that has shaped your work.
Yeah. Well, I can maybe start with a short list to also make it very clear to me. And that is actually, first of all, a system that oppresses spirituality and is really trying to radically erase the spiritual practices that we have actually still been able to bring with us and nurture and reinvent on the way. But this was really, this is, I think, a very traumatic experience in itself. And then we are dealing with a very disturbed reality where there is a game of masculinity and femininity being played out. And I personally feel that one element of that history which has been erased is that women were actually in the majority, right? In the minority. I mean, in the spirit of indentured labor in the beginning, especially. And in that sense, women gained some sense of power over the men because there were less women to marry with. And at the same time, they were actually a huge victim of massive abuse, rape. And this reality and this dimension, I think, is something that is almost not discussed. But it is a reason for me why I can so strongly feel that I want to connect, and I feel the urgency to connect with this feminine energy or the feminine lineage in this history. So these are already 2 points, and of course there is also the trauma of, or the realization of, okay, maybe some people have, I mean, let's also put it into context, forced labor migration, but from a reality in which the world, until today, the world has not seen a famine and mass death that has been so huge, right? Because about, we say, estimated between 50 to 80 million people died out of hunger during that very time in India alone, a time of colonialism, being colonized by the British. And that is the time in which people were forced to migrate. And that's why I think this is the most important reason to understand it as forced migration. That trauma, bringing that with you, seeing massive deaths, leaving families behind, experiencing death all around you because of oppression and exploitation, taking that with you to a country where you're hoping to find a better future. Because I do sincerely believe that majority of the people were hoping for a better future. But then to find again there a continuation of oppression is multiple traumas that are just intertwining with each other. And in many ways, you see a very interesting emancipation coming about in Suriname, in the Indo-Caribbean communities at large, I would say. And that's revolting against that.
I
And
was going to ask you about that, because I think when you talk about silence, there's actually a part of the silence is ignorance, right? So when I look at our community, a lot of people don't know about the resistance that was going on during that time. And I know from the archives, over a period of 50 years, there were 40 uprisings. And we don't know about those uprisings. We don't know about the leaders of resistance. We don't know about the names. We have statues of the colonizers in Suriname, but we have no statues or few statues of the people who went against those colonizers. And I know there's a movement now within our community to address that, but I'm so glad that you raised the issue of resistance, because I think that is something that is very much overlooked in the Indo-Caribbean community, because there's a very intentional approach of the colonizer to erase those stories, from our history. So what is your take on that, also in relation to art and resistance? And do you see your own piece as part of that?
Yeah, I mean, yes, actually, there's a lot of questions that are also popping up because of the things that you're saying. But if I just also very shortly try to answer this question, so resistance is a powerful tool, right? It is a tool, or a path, I would actually rather say, in which we really decide to take our own space and to decide the fate of our own future, instead of constantly being forced into a certain direction or a certain reality. But that very experience is also very traumatic, right? And what you're mentioning here is the erasure of that. 40 uprisings. Like, I had no idea about that. I think you were the one who actually taught me this, to be honest. The moment I found you and I met you, this was one of the things you mentioned. And I was also shocked by it. I was like, wow, are you like, this is amazing. And this is also then a question that I still didn't completely answer your question, how it feeds into my art, because I think by making this kind of art, I still am continuing to resist. I centralize spirituality, and I really use spirituality to resist radically, right? It's and it is, that's really a struggle in itself, because as an artist here in the Netherlands, uh, there's not so much space for your spirituality, right?
Yeah.
So I constantly am being rejected because of that. Like, okay, but this is not art, honey. You're doing some hocus pocus. We don't like this. Like, no, actually, I'm not doing some hocus pocus. I'm radically resisting, reclaiming my spirituality and reinventing that what I came from. And then I also have this question for you, because then how, since you're also an activist, and we share a lot of our realities, but for you as well, like, what is the meaning for you of resistance? And yeah, what is the meaning for you of resistance, and also specifically when it's about negotiating with
Yeah.
trauma?
Yeah, I think for me, resistance, there's so many dimensions to resist. I think one dimension is to speak out, raise your voice when there are situations of injustice, to not accept that, and to offer a counter narrative, or a voice that is necessary. I also think, especially for people of color and people from our community specifically, to be your authentic self is an act of resistance, because the society wants us to conform. You have a lot of people in our community. Just a simple example: our names. Some people westernize their names, to make it easier for white people to pronounce their names, or to make white people comfortable. And for me to reclaim that identity and say, this is how you pronounce my name, and I expect you to respect that, would be an act of resistance, because that is not something that, is expected of you, because you were always expected to, conform to society, Western society specifically. So and that was actually my personal journey, is to kind of rediscover, you know, um, where I'm from. And when you talk about spirituality, I was actually raised in a household that was not religious. Um, and so for me, even though I grew up with all kinds of, spiritual practices because they wanted to introduce me to, to all the diversity and leave the choice up to me. But, I became more and more, I identified more and more as Hindu, realizing that that is actually, my heritage and this is, where my roots are. And when I went to India 2 years ago, I felt a sense of calm going back to the motherland, reconnecting with that spiritual energy. So I think, those are also examples of resistance because when everything is geared towards disconnecting you from your roots, reconnecting with your roots is an act of resistance, in my view. And I'm curious to hear if you recognize that.
Oh, definitely. I mean, I'm 33 now, and I've gone through a lot of phases, right, in life. Also, when it comes to the way in which I relate to my specifically my Indo-Caribbean identity. And as I said, I grew up in this neighborhood where we have this huge population of Surinamese Hindustani people living, but there's also so many other people. And in my everyday reality, we were constantly being reminded of that. Yeah, right. So there was not really a space to question that, especially not in my youth. It's not like, so are you Surinamese Hindustani? Like, no, my reality was more like, so you are the Surinamese Hindustani, and all the Turkish and the Moroccan and the Iranian and the Afghanis, what everyone basically knew that. Of course, there was the divide. There was that segregation. There is still segregation going on in this city. I think the city I live in is the most segregated city of the Netherlands. Somehow, for a big part of my life, that white bubble that existed next to us was not really even in my gaze. I wasn't seeing that. I wasn't really concerned with that. It was so common to constantly be separated. Like the white people are over there, and here are all the migrants. So within that reality, I mean, I see you want to say something.
Yeah, no, I think it's so interesting that you address that because my experiences has been the opposite because I grew up in a white bubble in that sense. Like I went to a white high school, white primary school, white high school, white university. So I was always, one of the few. And, it wasn't until I went to university and, I also became more socially conscious that I started to question, the way that my framework of reference was being shaped. And fortunately, my parents were very active in the community, so I did get that experience. But I always felt too Dutch for the Hindustani community and too Hindustani for the Dutch community.
Yeah. No, I mean, I can also still recognize it because that was definitely the next phase, But another thing about also this phase, and at least I would say, at least until my 18th, was also that I was becoming more radical about that. I was really so diving deep into this whole idea of multiculturalism that I became a shape of multiculturalism that was often not even understood anymore by most of my migrant friends or outside, and not let alone the white world that was existing out there. They were like, but hold up, like, like what's going on? Like, are you Surinamese, Hindustani, or are you, like, why do you speak Arabic? And why do you speak Bosnian? Like, I came to learn all those languages and interacting with people. But I'm mentioning this because obviously it has shaped me a lot. And what is interesting there is the same way in which I was more radically interested in the other cultures except the white culture until for the most part of my life. And I went on to study anthropology. And so that fed even more into it. And then you also get the problematic dimension of where actually anthropology comes from. And not only that, but also where does that mentality come from? Why did I have developed, had I developed a mentality that was more interested in the other than in myself. And I think that mechanism in itself is really rooted within the whole colonial project, within racism, within what this Western society is built upon. We are invited to celebrate diversity, right? But we're not invited to really go through the deeper layers of what it means to have this diversity and where it comes from and what it's rooted in. And I think the similar reality of not confronting ourselves with that question has also not been confronted in Suriname, right? And that is really for me the tension between being an Indo-Caribbean, meaning that I come from a multicultural Surinamese culture. Even though I grew up here, I come from this multicultural Surinamese reality. And having another form of multiculturality here in the Netherlands. And another layer, and maybe I'm going a bit too deep, or maybe it's becoming a bit too complicated, but hey, deal with it. I would say, everyone.
I'm with you.
This is just our reality. In Suriname, I feel that we came to shape a common culture, a common Surinamese culture out of survival. So we had our distinct cultures. We have an Indonesian, Javanese, Chinese, Indo-Caribbean culture, and they all exist next to each other. But there's also a common culture, which we all acknowledge. We don't have to argue about that. But then here in the Netherlands, we have a very different reality. Multiculturality is considered to be a failed project. This is the dominant discourse right now.
Yeah.
I'm very much about reclaiming that discourse, to be honest. But the form of multiculturality never took that shape here, because here we're constantly being taught, everyone is being taught, no, we have the Dutch culture, and this is something that is important, that is really more civilized, and everyone should really like assimilate into that. And okay, maybe you also have your own culture next to that, but that you do in your own space. We create spaces for that, we create funding for that, and you just be with your own space, but don't make it too hybrid. Because when the moment when it becomes hybrid, and this is how I experience my reality, I have a very hybrid identity, it becomes confusing for almost everyone. Also with my own Surinamese Hindustani community, because they don't get it. And this is why often in the Hindustani community, I was being read to filth by Hindustanis about being too white. And I was just like, that's so funny, because I was not really having white friends, but they considered me white because I was not performing a certain kind of Hindustaniness or Indo-Caribbeanness that they were used to. So all this mix mash up of tensions really became much more important for me and transformative towards the end of my studies in anthropology and Arabic, Middle Eastern studies. And at that time, I had already specialized in Bosnia. So I was speaking Bosnian, Serbian, Croatian. It's all kind of the same language. And I was like, whoa, what am I doing? Why am I constantly interested in topics like identity and multiculturalism and oppression? Like, where does it actually come from? And that is the moment when also my whole artistry started to my artistic practice basically started to take shape. It's really deeply rooted in that. And yeah.
Yeah, so
I think I can go on for hours.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I think you addressed two dimensions that I would like to explore a little bit further. So one is you mentioned how, creativity is being viewed in our community as, something that should, be inside a certain box. And I recognize that, being a female artist doing pop, rock, hip hop, and not Bollywood, and what is being expected of you as an Indo-Caribbean creative. But also, you really described the very specific dimensions that are rooted in this Indo-Caribbean community. When you compare it, for instance, to the Indian diaspora more broadly, where people are children of people who actually migrated from India, to wherever around the world. That's a different type of identity development I feel when I interact with, our brothers and sisters. Um, then, the specific identity that we have shaped, being part of that multicultural society that is so used to the diversity. When you go to India, there's still, like, everyone looks like us, right? So, and that has a sense of recognition, but also I was really missing that type of diversity that we're used to in Suriname, where you really have that kind of eclectic vibe. So what is your take on the relationship with Indian creatives outside of the Indo-Caribbean community? Do you think that we interact enough? Like, what are some of the differences, maybe, or similarities that you have encountered?
Um, so I think actually for a very long time I really disengaged with the Indo-Caribbean community. That was really from the moment I started studying, and that means from my 18th till only a few years ago. And in those few years ago, it was when I started to develop my artistry, right? And to develop your own artistry, you really need to go inside. And going inside brought me to my Indo-Caribbean identity. I noticed that I actually almost exclusively connect with Indo-Caribbeans who are also artists.
As to you.
And of course, there is a practical side to that because we really feed onto each other in that, and we understand each other. We don't have to explain a lot of the dimensions that are there, but also because I think that artists and Indo-Caribbean artists experience this similar feeling of being different already from that what you experience otherwise in your own community. So this weirdness that is kind of washed on us is also something that connects us, and it also, artistically speaking, it really invites me to uh, create more decolonial work by, for example, not fixating myself on one aesthetics only. When I work with Indo-Caribbean artists, they have all their own very different various aesthetic realities that they've been creating to their art. And then it's the challenge to bring that together. And that process, for me, is really fascinating. Artistically, it's fascinating. In terms of collaboration, it's fascinating. And in terms of community building, it's fascinating. And I have really found that very specifically within a community of Indo-Caribbean artists. And I think we're really building that here in the Netherlands. And you're also very much part of that. And so I also in a way would like to hear from you. How do you, I mean, maybe I have a bit of a romantic idea about it right now, but how do you experience this?
Well, I think there's a specific community within our community of the Indo-Caribbean community. So, looking at, for instance, the people that we met through Masala movement, we're all people who, on the one hand, are really strongly rooted in our community, but have also had struggles to find our place within that community, for the exact reason that we always feel like, are we Hindustani enough? I think that is kind of the question, because you don't really recognize yourself maybe in, the Bollywood images that are maybe, considered normal. And so if you kind of step outside of that box, you're not sure how the community will respond. And my own experience has been that people really appreciate our creativity, our courage, our entrepreneurship. But there's a tension between, love for our community and understanding, how our community has been shaped, and the specific progress that we have made. but also sometimes there's a sense of disappointment that your community doesn't always support you in the way that you would like by going, for instance, to our shows or, supporting, the work that you do. And I think that's something that I had to reconcile with because um, if you focus on the part what they don't do, you miss out on what they do show. You miss out on
Yeah.
a sense of pride. And because even though they don't always understand it, there's a sense of pride for their children, for the generation, that is the next generation that is trying to find their own way. And I think for us, especially coming from a decolonial perspective, it's really important to have that intergenerational approach, where we really understand that everything that we've been able to do so far is because of the work that our parents and grandparents have done within the space they had, and the opportunities they got, and to really appreciate, the work that they've done, and to, move it forward and see how we can take on those next steps. So that is the way that I look at it. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's
Oh
my
yes, yes,
perspective.
very, very much. And to be honest, again, for me, you have been actually a very huge connecting factor in that sense. What you're mentioning about the intergenerational work, it's something that I personally was not experiencing, yet valuing that very much at the same time. And this is also feeds into a question actually that I have for you, because the role of role models, right,
Yeah,
in our life, to see other Hindustanis to do certain types of work, it really supports you a lot. And I really got that. I got it a lot from you. I got it a lot through the Sarnami House and also the work of what your father is doing. So I really celebrate it. And at the same time, I'm also wondering for you, like, how do you experience that, like the idea of role model, both in the contemporary reality we
yeah,
live in, but also historically
yeah.
speaking?
Yeah, I think that's a great question because that is something that I have always struggled with. And I think, the story of Titri, the Hindustani warrior of resistance, was one major story that really, really impacted me in a big way. I always say I had strong women around me, my mother, my aunties. In that sense, I never lacked role models, who were part of my, immediate environment. But when you look at, especially as an artist, at mainstream culture, historically speaking, indeed, I was really looking for those role models. And fortunately, I grew up in a household where I was really encouraged to create what hasn't been done so far. So in that sense, I was able to, you know, to carve my way without having someone else to look up to in that sense. But I think that is an important part of the work that I do now, is to really make that visible. And this brings me back to the question that I'm just, because I don't have any answers to it, I'm so curious to kind of unravel that. When you look at role models, I tend to look at the Indian diaspora more broadly. So, for instance, a few years ago, you had people like Russell Peters. I don't know if you know him, a comedian. And initially, I thought he was super funny. There were all these kind of skits that you recognize. But then, as you become more socially conscious, you're like, well, actually, it's not that funny. And then you come across people like Amir Rahman, like Hassan Minaj, and you're like, wow, okay, so these are people from our generation, from the Indian diaspora. They understand the experience of growing up in the West and not being afraid to criticize that Western society. But at the same time, they're still part of, they're not Indo-Caribbean. I uh, miss that part of that specific experience that is related to indentured labor history. And I'm wondering if when you look at, those types of role models, if you consider them a role model at all, if you also experience that specific Indo-Caribbean identity, I think we're missing that, and I think that's something that we within our community could really contribute to make that specific experience more visible and relatable, I guess.
Yeah. No, I feel you. I feel you totally. And I mean, it is that visibility, and actually there is also pain in that, for me, to be honest. I miss that visibility throughout my life, and I think this is one of the most important reasons why I worked through my process of identity in this particular way I described before, right? Which is more focusing on the other instead of the self, because there was only one kind of image of being, well, putting it a bit black and white, but there is a one dominant image of being a certain type of Hindustani, Indo-Caribbean here in the Netherlands. And that is not something that I really felt like, nah, that's not really interesting to me. And that process and the increasing visibility that I'm also experiencing right now with you is also giving another feeling to me. And that is, again, this reminder of erasure, right? And
Mm-hmm.
loss. So, and I'm I think really in essentially I'm still struggling with that. I don't have answers to that. I don't have a clear take on that. How to deal with the traumas that we are confronted with while being in a very emancipatory process. And I'm asking this question also to you. Maybe you have something for
Well,
me.
I think art in that sense is healing. Exactly what you're doing. The rituals, decolonizing rituals, our conversations between you and me, with others in our community. I think that is healing in itself. And I also always remember, whenever I, on an individual level, experienced pain or some type of frustration, I always think of our ancestors and realize that it's all relative. Everything that they've gone through is what we're going through is nothing compared to what they've gone through. And to be able to maintain that sense of identity and heritage. A lot of people in our community still, kept their spiritual practices. We have radio stations. We have, our celebrations. A lot of the culture that we come from has been preserved, and I think that really testifies to the strength of our ancestors to be able to maintain that, especially if you compare it to how slavery has erased, the culture of our African brothers and sisters. That that is another layer in itself that we didn't have to deal with because we still have been able to maintain that heritage. So I always try to focus on what we've been able to do in order to process what has been lost.
Yeah, and exactly, this is why we need also to have more historical awareness, right? And it's not only the kind of historical awareness about well, this and that happened, and we got there because of this reason. And in one way, for a big part, I think I'm still hanging a bit into that part of the history, right?
Yeah.
But there is all these amazing stories like what you're saying right now, and also the stories like Titiri,
Yeah.
And I'm in need of these stories becoming more dominant, to be honest.
Yeah.
Like there were, like you said, there were 40 uprisings, and
Yeah.
somehow I'm still emotionally focusing on, wow, there were 40 uprisings, we have erased that brings trauma about. That
Yeah.
is painful. Why has that been erased? But
Yeah.
actually, what you're saying is like, yes, we can look at it like that. But what if we actually celebrate those moments, right? So I
Exactly.
would love to have more of this kind of practices of commemoration, of
Yeah.
celebration, of and to get these
Reparation.
stories more out. Like
Yeah.
I need those role models.
But I think you addressed something, and this is exactly, I think, why we're having this conversation specifically within the internet context. I think the internet really has opened up that world for us. I think even you and I, even though we live in the same country, connected online.
Yes.
So, and I think actually a lot
Yes.
of creatives that we've met, we connected, on social media. That's where we found each other. And I think the stories, we no longer depend on traditional media to tell our stories. We have the online world to showcase, those stories and to celebrate. And I think, an important part of the process of healing is one, acknowledging. And I think that is where you're kind of, mourning the fact that it's not being acknowledged. And I think we shouldn't depend on the establishment for for moving from acknowledgement to celebration. I think it's important for our community if the colonizer acknowledges what happened. But if it doesn't do that, then I think it's up to us to do the work. And it actually works, because if you look at the Tittery story, where we started a few years ago, there was a book published and based on the research that Rajendra Bhagwambali has done. Then there was a documentary. Then, we did a song. We did the crowdfunding campaign to achieve the statue. That was all from our community. And then the municipality of Amsterdam decided to name a street after Tittery. So in the end, the colonizer acknowledged because we did the work, And we can say, oh, we don't want to do the work, the colonizer has to do it. But that is what struggle is that we do the work and we carry it with dignity and with pride. And in the end, the colonizer has no other option but to comply with our demands. And I think that is where we kind of also have that process of healing. We no longer depend on mainstream or others, but we really, really, rely on ourselves and the spirit of our ancestors to make those stories visible.
Yes, I mean, yeah, this is, I mean, indeed, it's also a bit of a short summary of a lot of the big steps, I would say, that the Indo-Caribbean community has made in
Yes.
the last few years here in the Netherlands. And to witness that, for me, it's like, wow, I'm in the middle of that. I'm seeing that. I'm being part of it to
Yeah.
some extent, but that is so extremely uplifting. And I really wish for these stories to be pushed more in many ways. Also, I hope still that we can continue to connect with this struggle still with others, because I
Yeah,
mean, there's
sure.
specifically the Indo-Caribbean community, but as we both know and we're very aware of, these are all processes that came about through a colonial project that has affected the whole world, right?
Yeah.
So we have so many brothers and sisters in this struggle out there, and connecting with them in doing this work can also transform the way in which we deal with our identities, I think, because I do have some perspectives about how Indo-Caribbean identity, or how even these concepts can have different meanings in the future. They have a certain meaning today, and they're very valid in every way. And
So what
as
are
the
some
whole
of your
this,
ideas for the future?
I mean, if I would just bring it very close to myself, it is definitely rooted in embracing this hybridity, right?
Mm-hmm.
The hybrid reality, hybrid cultures, uh, and not, again, obviously not to erase it, very much to embrace it, that this is also part of your root and of your core, and of your legacy, your ancestry, but in a way that maybe the world is not dominated by this politics, to be honest. The
Mm-hmm.
politics is important. That is like no discussion about it with me, to be honest. Identity politics is important. It's crucial in our emancipatory process. But I would love to imagine a world in which this identity politics takes a different shape, in
Yeah.
which we do not longer have to be expected or to be only confronted with the fact that you belong to one ethnic group, right?
Yeah.
Because again, what does this ethnicity means? You know, we you didn't talk, there are so many dimensions still to the Indo-Caribbean identity, because we also know that within the Indo-Caribbean community there's a lot being erased.
Yeah.
You know, the moment when you are mixed in an Indo-Caribbean family, very often the other ethnicities you're mixed with will start to be erased
Yeah.
very quickly. And that is not only rooted within the community, that is again rooted within the whole project of what ethnicity and
Yeah.
race means, and what we are taught about what that means in this very colonial context.
Yeah.
And it's still being taught to us today. So that is something that I still think and believe that we have a lot of work to do there. But we need to do this first. You know, like
Yeah. Yeah.
I like to
It's a
also be
process.
like real, like, hey, step by step, you know, step by
Yeah,
step.
you're absolutely right. I think that is, if there's one thing that I've learned from like decolonial conversations, is the realization of um, dismantling a system that is 500 years old. So also understanding that it will probably take another 500 years, to challenge that and to dismantle that. But I love how you refer to imagination. Imagining moving beyond whatever we think is possible today, because we don't have the ideas yet to imagine this new society where you can be proud of where you're coming from, but you're also able to connect with all those other elements that are part of your community identity heritage. So I think this is actually a good note to end on, don't you think?
I mean, honey, we can go on for hours
I
and
know
days and
we
years
can.
and five. We need 500 years more. You know, you just
Right,
said it.
very
But
true.
hey, you know,
So we'll continue the conversation offline then. For now, I really want to thank you for your time and for your insights and for the work that you do. So thank you so much. Is there anything that you would like to say before wrapping up this conversation?
I mean, Ani, of course, also thank you for all the work that you're doing and the legacies that you're building on. And it's extremely inspiring. And also, I love having this kind of conversation in this kind of format with you. And I hope we can also do this more, so that more of the world can really see this kind of important and beautiful conversations that we have. Because I really feel that we've tapped into a lot of layers and dimensions of how we position our Indo-Caribbean identity and what it means to our activism and what it means to decolonization. And yeah, I think this is a nice thing that I love also talking with you is, for me, you are really more visionary. You know, you
Thank
have
you.
much more you are very visionary, and uh, the celebrating of that what we have accomplished as a community is, I feel it very strong from your work. And where I am at still is very much busy with constantly negotiating with the trauma, pain, loss, and erasure. I also think obviously that it is something that is important. I think you see that back in the short film. If people watched it, it's there. You know, it's there. There is that struggle for me, and I think also it's still important, obviously, because there's transformative power within that. We don't have to
For
stay
sure.
with pain as simply being pain, or sadness, and all of that belongs to it. But there is a transformative power into that. So I think we need to confront both. And I like how we can uh, join forces to do that work together. So that, because if I would just stay the trauma and the pain and loss, you know, honey, I'm never going to change. I mean, I need to change. My work needs to transform. You know, this is what it is now. But let's hope in a few years, and let's hope I do not need 500 years to get there.
No, no, no. In that sense, we have each other to uplift each other. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. Thank you so much, and see you next time.